Hi everyone, and welcome to this next video in my series on writing an essay. If you've not watched the previous two videos, then I suggest that you go back and have a look at those. I've got one about planning an essay and one about writing introductions. Today we're going to be looking at writing point sentences. Now, lots of different teachers in different schools have different words for this kind of sentence. You might know this as a topic sentence, for example, or if you or at a school that uses the what, how, why framework for writing paragraphs, you might talk about having a what sentence. They're all the same thing by a different name, so don't worry too much about what I'm calling them. Essentially, this is the first sentence that you would write in each paragraph. So our point sentences are there for signposting the reader and guiding them through your essay. So it's really crucial to help your reader to understand your argument and how the different elements of it fit together. So what you should be able to do is pull out all of the point sentences from your essay and line them up next to each other and have an outline of your overall argument and be able to understand your argument just from those, and then the rest of your paragraphs build up that evidence base to support that particular. So let's have a look at an example then. I'm sorry if you don't study the Kite Runner, but this will apply, and I will ensure that it makes sense. You don't need a huge amount of knowledge about the novel. So our question is, with privilege come guilt and shame, to what extent do you agree with this view of the Kite Runner? So when I'm writing my point sentence, I start by signposting for my reader. So this signposting could be saying, firstly, secondly, however, despite. So signposting in terms of the argument, or as I've done here, it could be signposting as to where I'm talking about in the novel. Then I make sure I've got my focus on the writer. And as English teachers, we often talk about the difference between being inside and outside the text. If you're inside the text, you're writing about the characters as real people. If you're outside the text, you're focusing on the novel or the text as being a construct written by the writer to communicate a particular idea. And that second one, being outside of the text, is a much higher level skill, and it's what your examiners will be looking for. So I always like to make sure that I've got my focus on the writer and the choices that they're making in my point sentences, so that I'm constantly communicating to the examiner that I know that I'm writing about this text as a construct. After that, I often have an analytical verb, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a minute. And then I focus on the idea that I'm trying to communicate. So which element of the argument is relevant to this paragraph? So here we have, from the outset of the novel, Hosseini highlights how the privileged characters exploit those who are marginalised in society. Now, this is absolutely not supposed to be a straitjacket. It's not supposed to be a rule that you have to follow, but these are the elements that you're likely going to have in your point sentence. They might come in a different order, or you might have some of them in the second sentence, for example. You might split this into two sentences. That's absolutely fine, but these are the elements that I find work really well for me when I'm doing the starting sentence of each paragraph. So what I would suggest you do is pause the video now and have a go at writing a point sentence for a paragraph for the second question on the screen there. So look at the your turn column. It says Hosseini criticises the marginalisation of women. To what extent do you agree with this view of the Kite Runner? So pause the video, have a go at writing a point sentence using the pattern that I'm suggesting. If you don't study the Kite Runner, find a question that relates to the text that you are studying. Okay, welcome back. We're going to have another look at a second example. So example 2 has come up on the screen there. So same question. As the novel progresses, Hosseini uses the character of Amir to establish how feelings of guilt can be associated with inherited status, and thus he suggests that privilege can also entrap those who are members of the upper classes. So just take a moment to pause the video, and if you see the way I've highlighted the first example there, think through how you would highlight the second example using that colour sequence that I've got on the screen to identify the different elements of my sentence. Okay, brilliant. So what you can see here is what we're signposting. So as the novel progresses, focusing on the writer with Hosseini's name or outside of the text, got my analytical verb, and then I'm focusing on the idea, putting that argument forward. So again, I suggest that you pause, have a go at the second question and write a second point sentence, thinking about how you'd start your second P paragraph. Right, so here's a full example then. And as I said at the start of the video, what you should be able to do is almost pull the thread or pull out all of your point sentences or your topic sentences, whatever you're calling them. And you should be able to line them up and to be able to understand the argument just from those sentences. So just take a moment to read what's on the screen. Okay, so what you can see through those point sentences is a level of progression as I'm constructing and building my argument. You can see that my first sentence is establishing that argument, the second sentence is developing that, the third one is looking at the challenge or the other side of the argument, and then the fourth one is trying to resolve the two lines of argument that I've then got, so come to some kind of conclusion about that. So when you're writing your essays, it might be good to think about this. You might have a couple of essays in your exercise book at home that you've written recently that you want to just pause here and have a look through and evaluate your work. Can you pull those sentences out and construct the argument? Now, I mentioned I was going to talk about analytical verbs a little bit, and these are verbs that really help us to communicate the writer's intentions. And they're often verbs that students can throw in their essays quite quickly, but not necessarily always choose the most appropriate verb for the context. So what we've got here is a selection of verbs. You might want to take a picture of this or take a note of these verbs and try and work them into your writing. And let's have a look back at our so we can see how these verbs are being used. So you can see in my first point sentence, I've got Hosseini highlights. So this is our kind of basic level of analytical verb. Hosseini is showing or revealing or highlighting or emphasizing. It's quite neutral as a verb. Then you can see again in the second paragraph, again, I've gone quite neutral, and the same in the third, establishes, suggests. But then in the fourth paragraph, as I've built up my argument, what I'm able to do now is be a bit more punchy with my choice of verbs and really get that idea of the writer's intentions. So as Hosseini clearly criticizes the sense of entitlement. And those kind of punchy verbs can be really useful to communicate your line of argument. You might want to think about using tentative and assertive language at different points of your essay and your point sentences. Tentative language are words that suggest possibility, they show a bit of uncertainty. And then at the bottom of the list there on the screen, we have quite assertive language, which is quite confident language. You know, you're clear about your line of argument at that point. It can be quite useful to use tentative language more towards the start of your essay and more assertive language towards the end. But again, that's just a general guide. It's not a pattern or a rule that you've got to follow. So think through the kinds of language that you're using. So if my point sentences here, you can see with those two ideas in yellow that they're quite neutral. So Hosseini highlights, he establishes. And then in the green, I've got that quite tentative language, that idea of suggesting. It's a possibility, right? And then in the blue, you can see towards the end of my essay, I'm getting more assertive. In the blue, I've got that assertive language. Hosseini makes it absolutely clear. He clearly criticizes. So as you're writing your point sentences, you might want to think about balancing your tentative and assertive language as well as you're building up your argument. Okay, so my suggestion now is that you do a bit of practice. So you've got my example on the left, you've got my thinking in the middle, and then in the right column, I've put 4 new exam questions. You might not be studying Tony Harrison, you might not be studying the protest module, so it may be that right now you need to go and find your own example questions for your own exam board or your own spec and have a go at them. Well, what I think you should do is for each of these questions to write what your point sentences would be. So maybe think about 4 or 5 paragraphs for each essay title. What would your point sentences be? How are you going to sequence them? How are you going to include all of the ideas in the thinking column? How are you going to balance your tentative and your assertive language and your analytical verbs and so on? This is a really complex process and requires a lot of thinking, which is why I'm suggesting that you do 4 practices of this so that you can get into the way of it. Okay, thanks very much everyone, and I hope you watch my next video, which will be coming up soon, and it will be about embedding quotations and using micro quotations as well.